Chapter 12 of Clog Shop Chronicles by John Ackworth. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Vaulting Ambition 1. The O'erleaping. The Clogger sat at a table under his parlour window, with Fleetwood's Life of Christ open before him as a writing pad, a very short stumpy pen in his hand, smudges of ink on his fingers and lips, and an irritated, indignant look on his rugged countenance. Seated in a chair beside him, and bending so intently over him as to seriously incommode him and thus intensify his anger, was a long, thin-faced woman of nearly his own age, who wore under her shawl the brat of the ordinary card-room factory hand, which still had traces of cotton rovings upon it. This was Rachel Walmsley, Jabe's cousin, a widow who lived by herself in one of the small cottages between the chapel and the Fold farm. The two were occupied in writing a letter, which was a very serious business, as the Clogger hated writing, and Rachel could not even read. The letter was intended for the widow's only son, Richard, a young doctor in London. Rachel usually wrote about once in 3 months, using Jabe as an amanuensis, and the composition of the letter generally produced a fierce conflict between the two. Jabe, to whom the task was utterly abhorrent, was always bitterly sarcastic about some of the things dictated to him, and immovably obstinate about others, whilst Rachel was tormented with the suspicion that Jabe was not quite as scholarly as he pretended to be, and that her instructions to him were freely translated and often cruelly abbreviated by the penman to save trouble. The writing of this letter, therefore, was generally the occasion of a battle royal, out of which Jabe usually came with a complete loss of temper and self-respect, vowing with fierce resolution, " Aw'll niver write another one my heart's warm." On the present occasion, however, the letter was of more than usual interest, and Rachel was therefore more than usually trying, and Jabe was already in a high fever of irritation and disgust. " Theer !" exclaimed the widow, as Jabe, having over-dipped his pen, made a black spot on the letter, and then tried to remove it by using the end of his finger as a blotting pad. " That's the third blotch ta neet, wun abun every page. That's a bonny letter to go to a London doctor, isn't it?" " Haa con Aw help it wi' thee mawlin' about me ?" shouted Jabe. " Tha maks me over whacker." " Whacker ? Ay, that's ill temper. Tha ne'er had a grain o' patience since Aw knowed thee." " Temper ? Of aw the aggravatin' " But the Clogger stopped, took off his spectacles, laid down his stumpy pen, moved his chair from the table, and relighting an unfinished pipe, puffed away in grim silence, his weak member rocking up and down over the knee of the other leg at a frantic rate. Rachel, knowing well with whom she had to do, and quite unaccustomed to demonstrations of this kind, waited quietly for some time, during which Jabe, sitting with his back to her, gave vent every now and then to an angry snort. At length she said mildly —" Aar Rutchart thinks a seet o' thee, Jabe." Another snort from the Clogger, and a resumption of violent leg exercise. " He'll be whoam afore long naa, and there'll be noabry prouder on him nor thee, Jabe." The smoke began to puff from Jabe's pipe in short rapid whiffs. " Didn't tha read as he wor thinkin' o' settlin' amung his own folk i' Beckside, Jabe?" " Naa, Aw'll tell thee wot, Rachel," cried the Clogger, rising to his feet and limping to the table. " Aw'st finish this letter if it draives me madlet, but mind thee, Aw'st write no mooar, nayther for thee nor yo'r Rutchart." And with a visage of adamantine resolution the Clogger picked up his pen and sat down again before Fleetwood, demanding snappishly as he did so —" Wot's the next ?"" Tell him for to mind wot he's doin' wi' them Lundon wenches. They're a fawse lot, an' "" But Aw've towd him that awready." " Naa, tha hasna." " Then Aw said it th' last time." " Ay, but that's 3 months sin', tha knows." " 3 months ? Whey, Aw've towd him that i' every letter Aw've written this last 5 year. Dust think the lad's soft?" " Ay, but it 'ud be an awful thing, Jabez, if he browt a foreigner to Beckside." " Lundoners arna forriners, tha lumpyed. Tha'll be cawin' the super a forriner next because he comes fro' Lundon." " Tell him there's some gradely nice wenches in Beckside, an' "" Beckside shouted the Clogger, rising out of his chair once more in amazement and indignation. " Dust think there's ony wench i' Beckside as is fit for a London doctor? He'll live in a big haase, woman, wi' a brass knocker upon the dur, an' a sarvant lass, an' he'll want a wife as can talk fine an' play the pianney an' visit th' quality." For a moment a look of exulting pride stood on the faded face of the widow, but it disappeared instantly, and in its place came a look of alarm, which developed rapidly into intense anxiety. She leaned back in her chair, her thin face became ashy pale, and at last she said, quietly and huskily —" His muther'll shawm him then." Jabe banged the pen down on the book before him, and cried out in exasperated, despairing tones —" Hay, dear !" And then, suddenly turning on Rachel, he continued —" If yo'r Dick's iver shawmed of his muther, th' Longworth blood's bred aat on him, that's aw. Shawmed of his muther ! His muther's a meytherin' owd maddlin' iver to think o' sich a thing." But the thought was evidently a new one to Rachel, and rapidly took root in her mind. She became so occupied with it, in fact, that Jabe had no further difficulty in getting his task finished, and was too rejoiced thereat to notice the deeply pensive look on his cousin's face. Rachel had called at the Clog Shop on her way home from the mill, and when she reached her own cottage, the shadow caused by the words of Jabe deepened on her face, and tears dropped upon the highly polished fire irons as she made and lighted the fire. When she sat down to tea, it proved a long and melancholy meal. She had been made a widow by a mill accident some 20 years before, and had been left with one child, a bright little fellow of 6. Several offers of marriage had been made to her, but she had peremptorily refused all, and lived alone with her child, who spent all his time at Aunt Judy's when his mother was at the mill. Richard had grown up a fine sharp boy, of more than ordinary promise, and so when he was about 14 and had long been pestering his mother to allow him to go to work like other boys, Rachel had got Jabe to write to her brother-in-law, a tradesman in Manchester, to inquire if he knew of an opening for the lad. James Walmsley came to see Richard, and his own old home at Beckside, took a great fancy to his fatherless nephew, and finally took him back with him. But instead of finding him a situation, he had sent him to school again, and kept him there. Then he discovered that Dick had a strong wish to be a doctor, and so, after many consultations with Rachel, he was sent to a college, and after a successful career had qualified some years previous to the time of which we write. And the letter, to which the one which had caused Jabe so much trouble was the reply, had informed his mother that he was going a long sea voyage as a ship's surgeon, and that on his return he intended to come back to his native village and try to establish a practice in the neighbourhood. Now, all this had been marrow and fatness to the widow. She had feared he would never come back and settle among his own. Years ago, when on one of his rare visits she had hinted at it, Uncle James had shaken his head and quoted the text about the prophet in his own country, and then she was haunted by a terrible dread of his marrying some foreigner, and thus putting another barrier between them. But the fact that her heart's idol would not be the same simple, merry boy she had given up long ago with such terrible pangs, but a fine gentleman with quality ways and refined tastes, had never presented itself to her exactly as it did as the result of Jabe's words. She was no sort of companion for a gentleman, she saw instantly, and she did not hide from herself that she would probably be a serious hindrance to him in society, and also, by her unfitness to manage his house and preside at his table, drive him into that very matrimonial market from which she longed to keep him. For over 20 years she had worked and screwed and waited, sustained always by the dream of a strong, clever, prosperous son to love her and do her honour. And now the dream vanished into thin air. When he became a medical student she had given up all hope of his ever settling in his native village, and now, when her dearest wish was about to be fulfilled and her boy was coming home, she felt she must begin a remorseless process of self-undeception and give up all she had lived for. She blamed herself for not having thought of all this before. She understood now why Rutchart had pressed her so often in his letters of late to give up going to the mill. He had told her over and over again, in words that were milk and honey to her, that he was not of the marrying sort, and now he would be compelled to wed because his mother was not fit to manage a house with a brass knocker on the door and a sarvant lass in the kitchen. It was a long sad evening for poor Rachel, and when she retired to rest it was but to toss and roll about in perplexity and utter disappointment. Next night, however, Jabe noticed her pass the shop with a firmness of gait which was expressive of some change for the better in her mental condition, and after partaking of tea she fettled up the house rather more carefully than usual and went out to class. Coming down the Broo from the meeting, she invited the schoolmistress to make one of her occasional calls. The call included a sup of tea and a bit of apple pasty. Whilst they were sitting at the table, Rachel said suddenly, " Larnin's a fine thing, miss." " Yes," said the mistress, wondering what was the precise purpose of the remark. " How owd folk for to be afore they stoppen larnin' ?"" The younger the better, of course, but people are never too old to learn, you know, Mrs. Walmsley." " Ay, but yo' canna teich an owd dog ony new tricks." " Oh yes, we may all learn. Where there's a will there's a way, you know." But whilst the mistress was wondering what the conversation was intended to lead up to, Rachel suddenly changed the topic by asking —" Are yo' comfortable lodging wi' Bob Turner ?"" Well, fairly comfortable. They do their best for me." " Would yo' like for to stop wi' me if Aw gav' up goin' to th' shop ?" Rachel's house was a tempting little nest of a place, almost painfully clean, better furnished than most, and surrounded back and front with an old fashioned little garden which had often excited Miss Redford's envy. Rachel watched her visitor's face very narrowly as she asked her question, and saw instantly how welcome the change would be. And so, without waiting for her reply, she said —" Aw want yo' ta come an' live wi' me, and at steed o' payin' me owt yo'n ta larn me ta be a lady." An exclamation of surprise and amusement broke from the mistress's lips, but before she could reply Rachel had drawn her chair up close to her, and was pouring into her ears the perennial story of " Our Rutchart," adding, however, this time several fresh items about his approaching home coming, her own dislike of " foreigners," and especially foreign women, and her desire to fettle herself up so as to have some hope of keeping house for the doctor. They talked for a long time, the schoolmistress evidently shrinking from the proposed task, and also objecting strenuously to the other terms of the arrangement. But Rachel would have her way. " Yo' mun larn me my manners, an' haa to talk fine, an' to read an' write, an' yo' mun show me haa to tittivate th' haase up an' mak' it a bit loike a Lundon haase," persisted the older woman. And in the end, without the least faith as to the result, and with an uneasy sense of the ridiculous in the matter, Miss Redford consented to join Rachel in her little home. Now nobody was surprised when Rachel left the mill. Some even expressed the opinion that she ought to have done it long since, as it was well known she had saved a tidy bit. Everybody approved also of her taking the schoolmistress to live with her, for in the opinion of Beckside nothing was too good for that young lady. Of course the precise purpose of the new arrangement was carefully concealed, and it was only when it began to bear unexpected kinds of fruit that the neighbours remarked upon it. One Sunday morning Rachel appeared at chapel with a gorgeously bound hymn book, which she made a show of using during the singing, and Sam Speck actually stopped in the middle of a fine bass run as his eyes fell on the widow using a hymn book as big as the pulpit one, but much handsomer, and pretending to read it through gold-rimmed spectacles. A week or two later she appeared in that surest sign of feminine greatness, a watered silk dress, to which was added a little later a fashionable mantle. But the climax of outrageous innovation was reached when Rachel began to call her neighbours Mr. and Mrs., and to speak in a ridiculous mixture of dialect and fine talk. Now it must not be supposed that the schoolmistress was responsible for all this. She saw it with pain and shame. When the widow persisted in her first proposals, Miss Redford had acquiesced in the hope of being able in a quiet way to render her friend some assistance, or at any rate to prevent her exposing herself to ridicule. But she was soon in deep water. Rachel gave up learning to write after the third lesson, and proved but slow in acquiring power to read. In the art of making a fair show in the flesh, however, she effectually proved her true womanhood by comprehending and carrying out with astounding aptitude the gentle hints given by her instructress. Before long, indeed, she got out of leading strings altogether, took to going to Duxbury every week, where she bought her own garments, and was able to study at first hand the manners of the ladies she met with, and even produced afterwards slightly grotesque imitations of their toilets. The mistress's efforts were confined almost entirely to checking Rachel's immoderate zeal, though once she went the length of openly opposing the purchase of an outrageous bonnet which a Duxbury milliner had called so ladylike. They disagreed most of all, perhaps, on questions of colour. Miss Redford's diplomatic resources were strained to the utmost to prevent glaring offences, and she was driven back more frequently than she liked upon her one argument that never failed. " I'm sure the doctor wouldn't like it." It must not be supposed that Beckside was indifferent to these things. They were, intermittently, absorbing themes of conversation. At the mangle house, which was to Beckside women what the Clog Shop was to the men, Rachel's sudden rush into fashion was constantly canvassed and unhesitatingly condemned, and her manners and newly adopted modes of speech called forth all Lottie Speck's unrivalled powers of mimicry. At the Clog Shop the subject was discussed under difficulties, for Rachel was the Clogger's cousin, and for a time it was not known how he regarded the matter, whilst Jabe himself was too much disgusted to allude to it. Hints, however, were constantly being thrown out, and when one night Jabe said a word or two which seemed to invite discussion on the subject, he was told so many things that he boiled over with indignation. Next day he called on the widow with his temper very insecurely under control. As he opened the door and stepped as usual over the threshold, he noticed with rising scorn that the once carefully sanded floor was now covered with new carpet. " Ay," he began in withering tones, but before he could proceed he was met with the startling rebuke —" Jabez Longworth, you should knock when you comes into folk's houses." Arrested thus suddenly in his progress, and overwhelmed with what he saw and heard, Jabez stood in the middle of the room and glared around in speechless astonishment. Slowly his gaze focussed itself upon Rachel, and transfixing her with an annihilating glare, he cried —" Tha pride brussen, mean mawin, feathercock owd maddlin, tha ! Wot's up wi' thee ?" But Rachel was on her dignity, and so, bridling up, she returned his fiery glare with interest, and replied, betraying her excitement by dropping into dialect —" If tha's ony manners, tha'll tak' thy cap off in folk's haases." The Clogger stood back a step, surveyed Rachel slowly and deliberately from head to foot, and then with a tremendous thump on the table with his horny fist he cried —" Ay, Aw'll tak' my cap off, and mysel' too. An' Rachel," he continued after a moment's pause, " tha never hed much sense, but sin' tha sowd thy sowl ta warldly pride tha's lost what bit tha hed. Good mornin', Mrs. Walmsley." And taking off his cap he made her an elaborate mock bow, and stalked haughtily out of the house. But Rachel was not to be turned from her purpose. Her dread of being an embarrassment to her son, and her fear of driving him into marriage with the daughter of the Philistines, acted as a stimulant to her energies. But while she certainly advanced rapidly in some things, her language was a bewildering medley, and her Sunday outfit was fearfully and wonderfully made. At last there came a letter from the young doctor to say that he had landed at Southampton and was going to London for a few days, but would be home in about a week. Rachel heard the schoolmistress read of the going to London with a pang, but soon forgot it in the excitement of preparation to welcome her boy. Then came a second letter to say that Richard would reach Duxbury Station by the 4:19 train on Thursday, and for 2 nights poor Rachel never slept. Every few minutes she was asking her lodger if she thought the doctor, as Miss Redford always called him, would like this or that article of dress or furniture, and the young lady was glad to have that opportunity of correcting several things which offended her taste. On the subject of personal adornment, however, the elder woman was still untractable, and though the mistress's influence secured the omission of the more glaring ornaments, the proud mother was still more than sufficiently gorgeous when she started off in a trap specially hired from Duxbury to meet her son. Now that the time had come, she felt little of the elation she had expected, but in its place a nervous apprehension she found it difficult to account for. She was now certain that her boy would be too grand a fellow to care much for a factory hand mother whom he had only seen twice during the last 7 years, and that since mixing in such grand society there would be nothing in Beckside to satisfy him. Would he admire a plum-coloured satin dress in which she was meeting him? She was sure Miss Redford had been mistaken in recommending that plain shawl instead of the grand mantle, but at any rate she had her gold guard on. And so she arrived at the station in a flurry of anxious misgivings. Rachel had all a countrywoman's dread of trains, and stood a long way back when the express came in. In a moment she saw her son. Oh, what a fine fellow ! What a fine beard he had grown ! Here he comes. He has seen her, but after a hasty glance he looks further down the platform. He doesn't know her. Then he turns towards her again. She starts forward with a cry, and in a moment he has hugged her to his heart. But after a long hearty embrace the young doctor holds her from him, glances perplexedly at her grand outfit, and seems uneasy and a shade disappointed, she fears. During the ride home, though he talked freely as of old, he seemed to be always looking at some part of her apparel, and appeared a trifle flat and disappointed, and even, she thought, distant. But in a few moments Rachel had something else to think about. The day had been very warm, but during the last hour it had become sultry and thundery. Just as they were reaching the top of the hill out of Duxbury, the rain began to fall, and in a few minutes it was pouring down. Rachel had forgotten her umbrella. That is, she had left it at home because it was not fine enough. The doctor's had been left behind with his luggage to come by Squire Taylor's cart. There was no shelter near, and the driver had scarcely any wraps. Such as he had were hastily dragged from under the seat and wrapped round her shoulders, but in spite of all the poor widow reached home in a drenched and draggled condition. The schoolmistress met them at the door, and exclaimed as she saw their soaked clothes, but as it was still raining heavily they made haste to get indoors, and the doctor insisted that mother should go and change at once. But in the bedroom another scene took place. Rachel was disappointed and thoroughly out of temper, and obstinately insisted on putting on her watered silk. But the schoolmistress, having taken her measure of the doctor, insisted that the widow's ordinary black stuff was the proper thing, and was so firm that Rachel had most unwillingly to give in. By the time she was ready to go down again, she felt sick of the whole affair, and more than a little ashamed, and came into the wee parlour with a very penitent look on her face. The doctor was stooping down, pulling on an elastic-sided boot as she entered. But on hearing her footsteps he lifted his head. A look of surprised delight suddenly shone on his bronzed face, and jumping forward he seized her in his great arms, and giving her a tremendous hug, he cried, dropping quite naturally into the purest Beckside dialect, " Ay, Aw'd a fine lady at a trap with me, but this is my gradely owd mother." Chapter 13